Thank you very much, everyone here at Homerton College, University of Cambridge, as well as everyone online. Thank you for taking your time this evening to join us for this lecture here today. My name is Kennedy Mbeva. I'm a research associate at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. And together with my colleagues, Professor Hale and Dr. Eldred Harrington, we're very delighted to welcome you to the first of a series of 3 lectures on the series of UN at 80. So we find ourselves at a critical moment when 80 years since the establishment of the United Nations, which is what some would argue the most elaborate multilateral system that we've had to help us cooperate to address the challenges we faced. If you look back, you'll realize the UN was established when, in the aftermath of the Second World War. There's, of course, a reflection from the devastation of the war, but also some optimism looking forward on how to build a system that will prevent such wars and address other challenges. But if you look forward, if you look back and look forward, you'll realize today, this year, we're at a critical juncture. It's 80 years since the establishment of the UN and the UN system and the more broader multilateral system. But if you look forward, we have around 8 decades or 80 years towards the end of this century. So we find ourselves at a critical juncture where we are taking stock of what have we learned looking back. I think there's been much of that, especially this year and last year, or the last 2 years. But now I think we're at a moment where we can look forward and ask, what have we learned, and how can we maybe rethink how we approach the challenges that we face going forward. And to take up this task, which is a very daunting one, we're very delighted and very honored to have a distinguished set of speakers here today. And we have Professor Tom Hale from University of Oxford, and who, I'll give a personal disclosure. So I worked with Tom 1.5 years ago. He was my postdoc advisor. So much of what I've learned as well in the last couple of years from Tom. So for me, it's a distinct honor as well to have to welcome you, Tom, here in Cambridge. So we also have a very distinguished set of panelists here today. We'll get to introduce them in more detail, but we have Lord Martin Rees, we have Professor Harriet Bulkeley, we have Professor Sonia Amade, and we have Pamla Gopaul. We'll get to introduce them after the lecture. So Professor Thomas Hale's research explores how we can manage transnational problems effectively and fairly. He seeks to explain how political institutions evolve or not to face the challenges raised by globalization and interdependence, with a particular emphasis on environmental, economic, and health issues. He holds a PhD in politics from Princeton University, a master's degree in global politics from the London School of Economics, and an MA in public policy from Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. A US national, Professor Hale has studied and worked in Argentina, China, and Europe. His books include Long Problems, Climate Change, and the Challenge of Governing Across Time, which you get to hear about today, as well as other books, including Beyond Gridlock, Between Interest and Law, and Transnational Climate Change Governance. So without much ado, I'll welcome Professor Thomas Hale to kick us off with the lecture. Over to you. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Ken. It's a huge honor, but also a slightly complex feeling, I have to admit, when your former postdocs are now, budding researchers inviting you to give a talk somewhere. It feels like there's a generational dimension to it, which is welcome, but also slightly challenging for those of you who have experienced that in different ways. But it's really a pleasure to be here and a great honor to be joined by such a fantastic set of thinkers on these questions. The theme I want to talk to you tonight is about climate politics, and through the lens, as Ken mentioned, of the United Nations and multilateral cooperation and how we think about these problems. And to start off, I want to invite you to join me in a small thought experiment. So these cufflinks I'm wearing were purchased at a sort of cheap souvenir shop at outside the Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which met in 2017 in Katowice, Poland, which is a major coal-producing region. And so this coal you see here permanently sequestered on my wrists is actually a very ancient molecule, right? This coal you see here from Western Poland is part of a process that began hundreds of millions of years ago, when maybe it was a dinosaur or a palm tree, and it sort of sank into a swamp and lasted for a very long time, getting layered onto by other molecules of carbon and many other things until it became hard and compact in the coal you now see here. And unlike this one, most of its brethren in that swamp were dug up and were incinerated. And over millennia, this process of millennia was instantly transformed through industrialization into, of course, part of the climate challenge that we're now living through today. And so that this coal or its friends have seen huge transformations in the 250 years or so since people started really digging coal and other hydrocarbons out of the ground at scale and burning them to power industrialization. And during that time, human institutions, which is what I study as a political scientist, have changed immensely. Think of all the differences in our politics today from our politics in the 1750s or so, when coal really began to take off as a fuel source. We've had the rise of representative democracy. We've had the rise of communism, of totalitarianism, the rise of multilateralism, the invention of human rights. The whole idea of environmental governance is in some ways a new product of this post-industrial age. And so all the things that we sort of take for granted are, from the perspective of this coal, really a fleeting moment, right? A kind of blip in historical time. And that collision between geologic time on the one hand and human systems and their different time scales on the other is the theme I want to really dig into today, and why I wrote this book, Long Problems. The book tries to answer three questions. First, why are long problems hard to govern? And then how can we actually govern them? And then there's a part that also thinks about how we as social scientists, which is my area, can study them more effectively in our disciplines. Tonight, I want to talk to you about the first two of these, which are the ones I think are really the core of interest. And I'd say, of course, what long problems are. I want to talk about their governance challenges. I'm going to then hopefully leave you with the idea that we can indeed govern them, and give you some examples of how, despite our short-termism, we still do and can do better governing across time. And I want to end with a few thoughts on the nature of what that means for the nature of climate politics going forward. An example that's going to be featuring in this talk is picking up on the theme that Ken introduced, the role of United Nations, and particularly the Paris Agreement on climate change, which is now about to turn 10 years old this December. The most maybe recent of this 80-year-old trajectory. So that's our plan. I'm very much looking forward to your questions and your comments. So what are long problems? Why did I call the book this title? By this, I just mean any kind of problem whose causes and effects are separated by at least one human generation or more. So the process of climate change, which I described, the accumulation of mostly carbon in the atmosphere, which lasts for a very, very long time, right? The carbon we're putting up today is going to be there not just for our lifespan, but into the future, is a long problem, because the climate change we're experiencing today is about the accumulation of this whole process of industrialization 250 years ago, and the carbon we're putting up there now is going to be there for our children and their children to come. But there are, of course, many other examples of long problems in this way. And I argue that every kind of political problem has some kind of temporal span to it. So time span is something we can think about as a variable across different political problems. Some other long ones that you're probably thinking about are, for example, pensions. How do we create social systems that allow people to have a decent life after they stop working? In most of the parts of the world, pensions were set up during sort of early to mid 20th century, imagining a certain time and nature of how work happened, a certain set of lifespans that people had. And now, of course, we're in a very different world where the nature of work is different. Fortunately, people live a lot longer, and pension systems in every part of the world are in crisis because of these changes. We have to think of a new model there. Infrastructure. Urban planning, urban design is also a very good example. In this city, like the city where I live and work in Oxford, the cityscape was invented for a very different kind of way of living, a different kind of way of getting around a city. And now we have to think about how cities evolve and restructure themselves because of these decisions made a very long time ago. There's many more examples as well. Space waste, nuclear waste. I'd say every problem has a sort of time dimension. I think it's probably true, and this is just more of a tentative claim, that we have more long problems today than we did in the past because of this broader sort of collision between planetary systems like the carbon cycle, which have their own very specific and set time scale, and human institutions through the sort of Anthropocene moment that we're
we're living in. So I think that's probably creating more long problems, but it could be that we had lots of long problems in the past as well. Regardless, though, we have to think about how we solve them, right? These are challenging problems for lots of reasons. So what I try to do in the book is help us think about what long problems are and how they challenge our decision-making systems. You'll probably have heard of this moment on the screen in front of you now. This is a gathering in 1992 of the world leaders of the time. You'll see that they were mostly men at that time. I think it's before women in this picture. I tried to count. But they gathered in Rio de Janeiro, as also world leaders would gather this year in a different part of Brazil for the climate conference in November. But they gathered there to try to address the ecological crises that were beginning to become increasingly recognized at this time. And in 1992, I was actually in 4th grade, now I'm dating myself, they promised to everyone in international law that they would prevent dangerous changes in the Earth's climate. And since that time, they've met again and again and again and again and again. And this year we'll meet for the 30th time. And we haven't yet delivered on that promise made to my 4th grade self and to all of us. And so we think about this as a kind of quintessential example of governments here collectively, but also in their individual domestic behavior, kind of not really doing a good job of managing problems over time and succumbing to short-termism. And of course, in our own lives, we can see individual level cognates of this kind of problem where we're maybe not saving as much money as we should, or not eating the right things the way we should, or taking other kinds of short-term decisions that maybe were not designed or not optimal for us. But what I'm trying to do, and what I think we need to add, is for politics, this is a different kind of problem. It's not just that we kind of think about the present a lot in our limited little brains as humans. There's actually features of collective institutions, that is of politics, that are specific about why long-term issues are harder to solve sometimes than urgent ones. And that's what I try to do in the book, is to outline a few heuristics and concepts that help to understand this as a political problem. And as a political scientist, politics, sometimes we have to explain what political science is to non-political scientists. But I think, to my mind, it's the study of why different actors have different interests. It's the study of how those interests then are used to build power to advance those interests, how different institutions mediate contestation over those interests. And I think for the climate problem, we've often seen it, many people have seen it at least, as a scientific problem, a technological problem, an economic problem, a justice problem. And of course, it's all of those things. But to my mind, the issue today in 2025 is increasingly clearly a political problem. We have to figure out how to get the right consensus of interest, the right coalition of interest to build political power around a solution that's going to drive us to a better outcome. And if we fail to do that, then the best science in the world, the best technology, the most sensible economics will not lead us to where we need to get to. So I think this question of the politics of long problems is actually a really critical moment in our current moment. So what are the 3 reasons why I say it's hard to govern long problems? The first I call the shadow interest problem, which is a simple idea that people who are affected by a long problem, remember the effects are generations separated from the causes. So the people who are being affected by a problem don't yet exist. They are future people. Maybe you could think about young people today as more affected than older people. That's also relevant to it. But a lot of the people who will be affected aren't even here yet. And this is a very specific kind of political problem, because often in politics, it's when a group is negatively affected by something that the impetus for change comes about, right? Think about, for example, some of the big struggles in human history against, say, foreign oppression, or colonialism, or the anti-slavery movement. The role of oppressed, marginalized people was critical in that. Even though they lacked political power, their agency allowed them to resist, to find allies in the political establishment who were able to help them, and otherwise to advance these sort of foundational historical causes. But if you don't exist, you don't have agency. Your interests aren't clear. They're shadows sort of on the wall. We can maybe dimly glimpse them through the smoke of time, but we don't actually know what they are, and they're not here to tell us about them. And so we have this very faint idea of what the interests could and should be, and certainly no voice speaking for them unless we create one. So this is a barrier to more effective governance of political solutions on long problems, because the people who care most aren't here to make that care felt. The second political barrier to solving these kinds of long problems I call the institutional lag problem. So if you think about an institution, by which I mean a set of human rules to do something, like a law, a policy, an organization, the United Nations, any kind of humanly devised system, to be effective, it has to be somewhat what we call sticky in political science. It has to be durable in some kind of way. Can't just change every day. You can't have a new contract for your mortgage on your house every single day because it wouldn't really work as a commitment device. And so you need to have some kind of consistency to institutions, or they're not really institutions. But problems, especially as the time around them extends, can change, must change, often do change. There's no problem I can think of. Maybe if you can think of one, please let me know. That's sort of been really consistently the same across a generational kind of time frame. Think about the pensions issue I raised before. But institutions often don't update as much as they need to. And you know, Ken mentioned we're here on the 80th year of the United Nations. And many parts of that institution have actually evolved in certain ways, slowly and slower than they needed to. But perhaps the most fundamental purpose of the United Nations, to provide collective security to its members through a kind of idea that aggression was always be resisted by collective deterrence. That idea is embedded in the United Nations Security Council, where 5 permanent members, countries who happened to win World War II, were given a veto over those rules. And since that time, it's never been updated, despite many, many, many efforts to think through what a different system could be, what a fairer system could be. And in a world today where we have ongoing conflicts between nuclear powers in the South Asian subcontinent, between powerful states and weaker populations like in Israel and Gaza, between a huge country and a smaller country that used to be part of it, like in Russia and Ukraine, and Sudan, Central Africa, all this list of crises, and the Security Council has not been effective in any of them, right? So we have this institutional lag problem in a really severe way because it doesn't reflect enough of the balance of power and interest to be effective. So this is actually a really important and critical problem. The third barrier, though, for long problems is not just the gap between institutions and the problems they're trying to solve, the interests that are hard to see because they're in the future, but this idea of an early action paradox. And again, this is sort of intrinsic in the definition of a long problem where cause and effect are separated by a lot of time. Because for a long problem, you kind of have to act on it in advance. If the cause is here in time and the effect is there in time, you're not going to change any of the effects unless you get started now. But if you have to start now, you don't have that much certainty about what the actual outcome of the problem will be in the future, or how your intervention now will actually wind its way through the causal paths of history to bear on that effect in some time. And so you have a lot of uncertainty, and you have to act on it under that uncertainty. At the same time, because the effects haven't manifested yet, you have a lack of salience. Salience means, do you pay attention to it or not? And in politics, high uncertainty and low salience are 2 kisses of death for any kind of political change you want to make. There's always something more urgent, like every day, there'll be 25 things that are more urgent than the thing that might be more important. And if you have uncertainty, it's always easier to delay, to ask for more evidence, to try to find to kick the can down the road, to muddle through, instead of trying to say, okay, we know we might take a risk, but this way or that way, but we're going to do A or B. So this is a really hard problem, and we're not able to sort of magic it away. It's something we have to think about how to adapt to. And so if you layer these 3 challenges of long problems, shadow interests, institutional lag, or the action paradox on top of each other, you get quite a difficult political outcome. And it's sort of, this is the point where I was writing this book, I was like, wow, this is a really hard set of problems to solve. Is there anything we can do about it? And here's now the encouraging part. And this is the key point I really hope you'll take out away from the talk, or if you have a chance to look at the book from the book, is that we can govern long problems. And actually, the reason I think that is because we have lots of evidence of different ways of doing that all around the world today. And so the challenge of governing long problems is not to revel in their complexity, to revel in their difficulty, but rather to understand the mechanisms of why they're hard, as I've just talked through, and to then think about different solutions that bear on those problems and help us through them. And as I hinted at, one of the ones I really want to focus on today is the Paris Agreement, because I think it has some features that speak to some of the challenges I've addressed. But the key thing here is that there's no silver bullet. So this book is not, here's the 4 things you need to do to solve a long problem. It's a very diverse and multifaceted set of solutions that I think are part of this larger challenge of governing across time. And don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all of these here tonight. I just want to give you one short example of some of them, and then spend a few minutes talking about the Paris Agreement as an example. But as I said, the key message is that there's lots and lots of ways to actually work on these different hard political challenges. So if we have this problem of shadow interest, we don't have agency for people in the future people to affect politics today. One way to solve it is to give them representation of some kind. Many of you probably will have heard of the Welsh Commissioner for Future Generations, which was a pretty innovative idea created in Wales in 2015 in response, in fact, to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And it's an institutionalized voice created through law who says to the Welsh government, you should think about this thing in the future more. So it's kind of a gadfly and a representative, a person to speak for those who can't speak for themselves. And one of the things that this role has actually, I think, had a really powerful effect on is saving the Welsh health system, the sort of NHS of Wales, a huge amount of money by investing more in prevention as opposed to treatment. It's something all health systems know they need to do, but it's often really hard to make it happen because there's no one whose job it is to say, let's do this, and I'm going to like really push until we do that. So by having someone whose job it was to do that had helped save a lot of money. We can actually go further, though, on the second idea of not just giving long-term interest a voice, but actually giving them some decision-making power by creating what's called a trustee. So you probably will have heard of like the principal agent problem. And the principal is the decision maker, the agent is the entity, the principal empowers to do what they want to do, delegates the authority to them to do what they want to do. A trustee is someone you delegate power to who does what you don't want to do. It's someone who ties your hands or constrains you in some way. And the classic examples are central banks or courts or institutions like that. But there's a really interesting example from California called the California Air Resources Board, which goes by the great acronym of CARB, which is not very popular in California, but is nonetheless a useful institution. And it's a sort of very independent regulatory body that sets a lot, operationalizes a lot of California's quite successful climate change rules. For example, their emissions trading system, their vehicle standards, their clean air standards, and other aspects of California's climate goals. So the legislature will set the actual target through the usual legislative process, but then there's quite independent bodies in charge of delivering it through a lot of discretion and allows them to adjust, and they have different timescales because they're appointed for longer terms than the assembly. You can also try, in this realm of trying to represent shadow interests, to extend the time horizons of people in the present to give them a chance of having a bit more proximity to the future people, even though they're, of course, not going to be, have a time machine. And one of the ways that I find, the research has found is really interesting to do this is through more deliberative decision-making processes. One example, of course, are assemblies, which we've seen on climate change, but also many other issues. And I had a chance to experience this personally recently in Oxford, where I live. I imagine it's similar here. The big local political issue is traffic. People are fighting about it all the time. The cars, too many cars, too few cars, too many bikes, etc. Everyone's really mad about this topic, and the politics got really contentious. The council of the county council flipped on this issue. So what they did actually was create a citizens' assembly on the future of transportation in the county of Oxfordshire. And it's been a fascinating kind of example of how people who really feel strongly and fight and vote a lot on this issue have come in a more deliberative process and actually mapped out a kind of 50-year vision for what we want our city and our county to look like. So changing the nature of the debate in this more deliberative way has actually changed time horizons in a very interesting way. Okay, what about the institutional lag problem? And here the challenge is really, how do you get the right kind of balance between durability, having stuff that lasts, for example, all the way to 2050s, deliver a net zero goal, but also to be able to adapt, to react to changes, like say, an invasion that changes energy prices or other kinds of shocks. You need to kind of get that balance right. And the point I'm trying to make on this is that we don't have a formula that says, okay, you should have this much goal setting, this much calibration over time, and because you can't kind of set that ex ante. But what you can do is create a suite of different sort of institutional checks and mechanisms that mean you at least have a chance of navigating and surfing that tension in a more careful way. So the first step of that is, of course, the durability part. You have to set a goal of some kind. And we see lots of examples of goal setting through national systems, multilateral systems. This is a poster referring to the fourth Chinese five-year plan, which of course is a way to really use planning and goal setting as a governance tool at scale. We also see examples from Saudi Arabia of their 2030 strategy, which is extremely detailed and gains a lot of political power domestically. You'll also be familiar with the UN development goals, and Pamela might tell us a little bit about Africa's the African Union's 2063 agenda. So goal setting is, of course, important, but you have to combine that with some kind of way of updating. And here we see a lot of times we use some different sort of review provisions in governance, but often not. So a very simple idea is when you create a new institution, new law, new policy, international organization, whatever the thing might be, you should have some kind of moment where you sit back and say, should we keep going like this or should we change it in some way? These are often called sunset clauses or review clauses of different kinds. Does anyone know, if you've ever had, how many laws passed by the Parliament in Westminster have this kind of built-in check function? And sorry, I'm thinking about laws in the last 10 years. Any guesses? A lot, a little? None. I couldn't find one. So if you know one, please let me know, because I'm trying to find examples that I can refer to. But actually, it's very rare and infrequent you build these kinds of things into rules, and these can have pretty consequential effects. So in the United States, where I'm from, the Supreme Court struck down the constitutional right to abortion a few years ago, as you'll have heard. And many of these laws that then suddenly applied were state laws from the 19th century that had very different expectations about how people's bodies should behave and what the society thinks would be appropriate. And so the kind of lack of checking on when you should turn things off was actually quite consequential for people's lives. Right, so you also, of course, need to think about how you combine them, and we have lots of mechanisms in the climate space that try to do that. One rule we don't use enough, I would think, are simple triggers. So often we now have a world where insurance is increasingly difficult for many people to get because, not least because of climate-related natural disasters that are pushing important parts of the world into an uninsurable category. So one of the solutions people have proposed is not to have the sort of usual insurance process where you something happens, you assess the damage, and then you have some sort of payout months later from some contested claim about how much is it really worth or not, but rather a sort of disaster trigger, sometimes called parametric insurance, where something happens, there's an immediate payout just because that thing happened. So it's a different price, less valuable, but it allows you to actually insure places where you know things will happen, but the value is harder to predict. So having these kind of automatic triggers that kick in right when something happens is a valuable tool that you see in some places, but also not others. Another idea, maybe the oldest idea humans have devised for governing long problems, is the idea of building a reserve. So if you had uncertainty of whether the harvest was going to be fruitful next year or not fruitful, if there's going to be drought or abundance, you would store a little bit of your food in maybe a nice cave to build up resources for the future. And some countries are doing this really well. And this is a picture of a oil rig in Norway, which of course has built the world's largest sovereign wealth fund from its oil wealth. This was designed originally, when it was created in the 1990s, as a way just to smooth kind of year-on-year market fluctuations. Sometimes prices are higher, sometimes they're lower. Let's try to average it out and make it smoother so we can be more predictable in our spending. But more recently, the government has tried to think about it more as a transition fund, whereas oil and this huge resource Norway has benefited enormously from winds down, can we replace it with some kind of permanent fund that pays us back at least some portion of that wealth going forward? So in other words, turning the limited resource into a more infinite resource. And that's the kind of reserve that helps to build the adaptability. Great, let me skip through these ones quickly. There's a new move this year. The Kenyan Senate, which you see pictured here, created a new caucus, a caucus for the future, to have a chance in the Senate to actually check on whether new laws being passed are robust for different kinds of uncertainties that might come up. So this is a simple sort of legislative mechanism for future problem looking. Experimentalism is another idea on the early action paradox where you don't always know how to get around something. That's the uncertainty problem, but you can set up a process to help overcome that uncertainty if you have a clear goal and iteration on how to explore ideas for finding a solution to that. And the Montreal Protocol, which people hail as a great success of international environmental law, I would argue, and others have argued, has much more of this experimental feature for solving the problem, right? You had to get rid of these ozone depleting substances that were harming the ozone layer. The text of the Montreal Protocol says we shall abolish them. And then their subsequent protocols create more and more strict rules around how quickly to abolish them. But one of the underexplored parts of the Montreal Protocol was something called the Technical and Economic Assessment Panel, which was a more experimental device that actually had companies and regulators sitting down together and saying, how far can you go on this technology? How far can we go with that technology? And so the kind of targets and timetables that the protocol was setting was actually sort of the product, not the driver of this more experimental approach of thinking through what might we be able to do, go try something, bring us back what that possibility could be, and then we update it over time. So this is, I think, a really undervalued feature of international environmental law. And of course, the world, this is a time series graph showing you how much more ozone we have with the Montreal Protocol than without it, according to a counterfactual model that NASA developed. But this great success came from this more experimental approach. Right, so let me just close by talking about the Paris Agreement, because I want to make sure we have time for questions. The whole problem with the catalyst, with the early action paradox, is that you kind of have to get action going before the causes are felt. But that's when people who really don't want to act for maybe the reason that they're very invested in the status quo are most powerful. And so how can you devise a system that actually allows you to begin to make progress, even when you have this very strong political opposition to doing what needs to be done to solve the problem? So the idea of a catalyst comes at exactly this sort of obstructionist feature of the early action paradox. We often think about solving a global collective action problem like the climate crisis by having some kind of global deal. And this was the logic people brought. That picture I showed you before of the world leaders gathered in Rio in 1992. They thought we need a kind of global deal to be able to agree, Harriet will do this much, Ken will do that much, and I will do this much, and we'll all monitor each other. And if you don't do what you're going to do, there'll be some kind of penalty. In the case of climate change, very weak penalty, but nonetheless there is a penalty. And that's going to be the way we make sure that there's collective action, because I know that if I don't do what I'm going to do, Harriet's not going to do what she's said she would do. And therefore we need this institution to kind of force us all to agree and to commit us to doing so. And that was the logic of the Montreal Protocol. People said, although I would argue is this more experimental one. And it was very much the logic of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which tried to apply this idea to climate change. And it was always intended as a first step. A small initial set of commitments that would be updated in the future. But it's the first step that never really took off because the largest emitter at the time, the United States, never joined the agreement, and the agreement had no provisions or restrictions or commitments for any of the growing economies during the 1990s, China's, the Indias, etc. And so it was always intended as a first step, but we really didn't go very far. And so when the time came to take a second step, which ended up being at the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009, and there wasn't an agreement, it was seen as really a disaster for this idea of a global deal to solve the issue. And even though institutional lag is the more dominant category, I'm actually quite fascinated as a student of world politics why we had an evolution in 2015 to a different model, the Paris Agreement model, for addressing the problem. And the solution is actually quite different. And I would say it's a great example of this catalytic approach to long problems. Because the Paris Agreement doesn't say, let's have a global deal. It negotiates how much everyone's going to do, and then we monitor and enforce that. It rather says, you tell us how much you can do. I'll tell you how much I can do. And we'll iterate on that over time. There'll still be monitoring, so we'll have to have some sense of knowing who's doing what. But the idea is not to solve the collective action problem by committing people to that, but rather to create a critical mass of action that should, in the theory, beget further action over time. So we call these in social science threshold models sometimes, where you think about a kind of critical mass growing, which then creates further reactions. It really depends on this idea of increasing returns, where there has to be some kind of mechanism through which the critical mass of action begets further action. But people kind of ignored that channel for the first, whatever, from 1992 to 2009 or so, until that sort of first model failed, and they updated it with this Paris approach. Has it worked? Will it work? I think, it's obviously non-trivial to establish the right counterfactual. But if you look at this graph, which shows you in the blue line, the expected outcome for the temperature in this century, temperature change this century, under different scenarios. And the gray line, the blue line is the current policies, implemented policies that countries actually have on the books. So that's how much temperature change we can expect at different points in time. The gray line is showing you how much temperature change we could expect from the targets and pledges. So not the policies actually said, but the things we've promised to do. And that's also, that's the gray line. What you see is that in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was signed, here we were in our kind of policies were something like over 3.5 degrees, but our pledges actually, because of these first round of NDCs in Paris, went way down at the time. They were kind of, in Copenhagen, maybe here at 3.5, but the first round of pledges under Paris brought it down to always something, between 2.5 and 3. And the policies also began to go down. Now, pledges went back up a little bit in 2016. I don't know if any of you can remember something that happened in 2016. So there was a bit of a backsliding there. But at the first ratchet moment of the Paris Agreement in 2021, the pledges went down a lot more. So we went from a world where, in a pledged world, we were kind of on track for 3.5 degrees to a world where if all the pledges were met, we'd be something closer to 2 point something. Now, the policies, of course, are behind that. I mean, policies have not got off to the pledges, but they've also moved a lot, right? From over 3.5 degrees, something more like 2.7 in that dimension. So to my mind, this is evidence of a catalyst working. It's not working in the sense of getting us to where we need to get to, which is more down in this realm, but it's certainly moving us forward beyond where we were before. And that's, I think, a source of hope. So those are lots of ways we can solve long problems. I think this is maybe one of the most important things for what we as social scientists, what politicians, what those of you who are thinking about making policy impact in the world will be involved in this century. Because I think if we have to solve a problem as vast as climate change, as vast not just in scale and scope and in width, if you will, and geographic dispersion, but in time, in its temporal scope as well, then we have a seemingly intractable problem. But I put this picture here to end with because I love a quote that geologists tell me. Various geologists told me this quote many times over the years. I think it must be taught in Geology 101 because they all seem to love it so much. Where it's that we shouldn't see rocks as nouns. We should see them as verbs, right? A mountain, the process, if you're a geologist, is changing all the time. It's not some sort of static thing. And for those of us who study not rocks, but human institutions, they are much more malleable, right? These are things that actually change all the time. And maybe if you, zoom out enough in time, change is the only constant with human institutions. So in that sort of temporal view, there's a real, I think, hope and a possibility that we can actually change the institutions in ways that lead us to be more effective at governing across time. And the evidence of the different examples I showed you today, I think, begin to show there's a bit of a groundswell going on of these kinds of changes that we can build on. Last year, the world got together again, as it often does. This was in New York in September of 2024. And at that moment, in this sort of geopolitical moment of tension and crisis, countries nonetheless managed to agree a declaration on future generations in which they committed, again, a sort of hortatory promise, to safeguard the needs and interests of future generations. And those words can land very hollow if they're not connected to real action to deliver on the ground. But I would argue there's also a way to see this kind of declaration as another catalyst for the kinds of transformations in governance that we're seeing bubble up in all different forms, small scale, large scale, around the world. And that's a question, for our agency again. So, we are now facing a climate crisis. We're beginning to develop these kinds of more long-term tools that I think will be helpful guides for us to navigate through it. If we take them, I think we'll find ourselves in a much better scenario. If we don't take them, then the impacts of climate change, the increasing turbulence that will follow from less stability and more tension, will push us actually to more short-termism, I would suspect, more inward lookingness. If you're the mayor of a city where the temperature at night has been over 50 degrees Celsius for the whole week, are you going to invest more in life-saving air conditioners or climate-saving solar panels? Of course, you have to invest in the air conditioners, right? You have to do that. It'd be a crime not to. So we're at this kind of really interesting political moment where our agency is the thing that will determine, are we going to shape these institutions? Or are we going to, in a way that's going to make us more long-term? Or are we going to let the long problem shape our institutions in a way that's going to make us short-term? And in that choice, I see some hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hale, for that stimulating conversation. And what I picked most first and foremost was the zeitgeist, because we've been talking a lot about the problems, doing a lot of diagnosis about what has gone wrong to get us where we are. But I think we haven't done much prognosis and looking forward and trying to kind of envision a future that we want to build, but also how do we get there, asking how we get there and working to how we get there. And I think from the very excellent chat, I think, or rather lecture, a couple of things I picked out. One is the need to scan the horizon, look ahead and look towards the end of the century, that's 80 years from now. Think about the nature of the problems that you're facing. We've seen climate as one of the really difficult problems, but also kind of having other similar problems. But more importantly, the notion that we can solve those problems and kind of turning our attention to that. And on the note of hope that Thomas concluded on, I'd like to now turn to our stellar panel. But before I do, just to note a couple of things. First and foremost, this session is being recorded. So for those of us here and online, please note that. Second, for the question and answer session, we'll have, you'll see the Slido QR code. Please type in your questions. We'll try to get as many questions as possible to the panel. And so please type your questions there. And I think just to switch now to the next session where we have a wonderful panel who will get to reflect on the theme, but also within part of the experience. I'd like to invite them to the stage. And we have Lord Martin Rees, Professor Harriet Bulkeley, we have Professor SM Amade, and online we have Pamla Gopaul, who's with us from South Africa. And we'll start with Lord Martin Rees, who's Lord Martin Rees of Ludlow, OMFRS, very distinguished. He's a Britain's Astronomer Royal and Professor Emeritus at the University of Cambridge, where he served as the Plumian Professor of Astronomy and Experimental Philosophy, Director of the Institute of Astronomy and Master of Trinity College, a former President of the Royal Society and Crossbench Life Peer since 2005. His pioneering research spans galaxy formation, cosmic jets, black holes, gamma rays, and speculative topics like the multiverse, extraterrestrial life. He co-founded the Cambridge Center for the Study of Existential Risk, where I'm based at, to address long-term global challenges from climate sustainability and biodiversity loss to the governance of powerful new technologies. His books include Our Final Century, On the Future, Prospects for Humanity, and If Science is to Save Us. So this is very distinguished kind of background, Lord Rees, and I'm sure you have written a lot about some of the big challenges that we face, and especially looking further into this century. So I'll invite you to share your reflections on the lecture, but also weaving in some of the work that you've done and some of the writings that you've produced.
You want me to talk now?
Yes, please.
No. Well, I really wanted to say that the difficulty is too many fast-changing parameters. Let me give an example. If one goes to Ely Cathedral, one is amazed at this vast structure, which was constructed several hundred years ago by people whose horizon was no further than Fens. None of them knew anything beyond Europe. And they thought that the world had been around for a few thousand years, and it might only go on for another 1,000 before there was some apocalypse. But nonetheless, they built this cathedral, which they knew wouldn't be finished in their lifetimes, and which still inspires us centuries hence. That seems a paradox. If we compare it with the present situation when we don't really plan far enough ahead to build something that takes 100 years. But I think there is a resolution of the paradox, which is simply this, that in medieval times, they may have thought the world would end in 1,000 years, but they thought the lives of their children and their grandchildren would be similar to theirs. So the grandchildren would appreciate the finished cathedral. Whereas now we have a knowledge of a world that's been around for 45 million centuries and has an equal amount of time in the future, huge horizons, but we can't predict nearly as well as they could in the Middle Ages what things will be like 50 years from now. And I think this is the main impediment to getting people to take seriously the implementation of the obvious long-term policies, which we think that we need to do to deal with climate, and which we've heard about in the lecture. It's just so many other things, and at the Centre for Existential Risks, we have an ever-lengthening list. We worry about obviously cyber attacks, pandemics, not only genuine natural ones, but engineered ones as well, and all these things. And we also live in a world where for the first time, everything is interconnected. You can't have a mega disaster in one continent without it cascading globally in the way that certainly did happen in the Middle Ages when we had the Black Death, but that didn't affect Australia. So we have a connected world which is subject to very short and drastic changes which are not predictable and are the consequence of our fast changing technology. And it's that which makes everything very different. And it's not just technology, geopolitics might look very different 10 and 20 years from now. And that again is, it's not something that stops us thinking about 50 years ahead, but it does stop about formulating effective action. And so I think it's the short-term uncertainties which impedes effective action in dealing with the long-term perils, which we can at least predict fairly confidently, such as climate change.
Great. Thank you very much, Lord Rees, and I think for setting the context, and kind of also emphasizing the point that even though we still kind of have to think in the long term, but we also have to think about the fast changing nature of the problems and the need to kind of rethink how we address and solve them. So I think to build on that, we have Professor S.M. Amade, who's joining us in the panel as well. He's director at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk here at University of Cambridge and a tenured political scientist at the University of Helsinki, where her research spans nuclear security, climate collective action, and AI's risks to governance. She's completing a book on computational tyranny and is the author of Prisoners of Reason and Rationalizing Capital Democracy. Former professor at Central European University, Ohio State in Swansea, and a visiting scholar at the LSE New School in Harvard. She's held Berggruen Fellowship at Stanford and remains affiliated with MIT. Professor Amade has co-led NATO's dynamic democratic support on Finnish defense policy following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Finland's NATO accession, and has co-authored an influential study on the same. Since 2021, she has directed Helsinki's Global Politics and Communication Master's Program, hosting high-profile events with Finland's former president and EU parliamentarians and securing a US Embassy exchange with UNC Chapel Hill. It's a very extensive background, so could you please share some of the insights from your work?
Thank you so much, Ken. I'm so delighted to be with everyone and to be here with Tom Hale and have had the opportunity to read your marvelous book in preparation for this event. So first, I wanted to just take a moment to celebrate the Financial Times and other outlets mentioned that the EU is within a 1% of reaching its climate goal target, which in this time of this geopolitical circumstance, I think we should celebrate that moment of optimism. And it really speaks to the power of governance. And I think the EU, probably of all the different governing bodies that taps it into the United Nations, gives us the greatest hope. So I think that's a moment to really reflect that we can just as with the ozone layer, we can make a difference on this. I did want to grapple directly with, I think it's not even really the elephant in the room, but this turn to populism. And I wanted to engage that question of, well, if we are going to continue the regimes of governance that would be favorable to grappling with climate change effectively, we are going to have to grapple with this turn to populism. What exactly does that mean? And then how do we grapple with the way that neoliberal political economics, which leads to increasing socioeconomic inequalities, is a driver in the sense that it makes great differences between winners and losers. And then it seems to be that especially those who were privileged before, who end up being losers in a new political moment, political economic moment, that then they want old solutions. And if we don't solve this problem, and that's the question I really want to ask, how do we make sure that our institutions of governance are flowing effectively so that they're up to this challenge? And I think that we need to address that. That would be my number one question and point. But then I just wanted to throw in a couple others because the reading and your presentation is so rich. So I know that, well, I think it's fair to say it's more than an influence from Bob Keohane. You're Bob Keohane's student. And so Bob Keohane has the neoliberal institutional approach to political economy. And I've had conversations with him about, he really doesn't think it's fair to compare that approach to neoliberal political economy, even though it's the same name. But on the other hand, reading through your work, and I think one thing that was really nicely, what's effective for a public audience is that you don't go into you don't mention prisoner's dilemma, thank goodness for that. But on the other hand, I think that the approach that you put forward and that Bob Keohane puts forward is relatively within the current framework, the assumptions like the desire, belief, preference approach, the incentives approach, the idea ultimately that, well, there should be some attempt to say something about how do market solutions figure in with the neoliberal institutional approach, because we know that it's easy for people who have that the torch of political freedom, they want those free market solutions. And so that's sort of a second element up there with the populists. As we know, Trump and his populism is not necessarily for the free market with his tariffs, but on the other hand, there's that branch of free market solutionism, which is just outright, let's not worry about the externalities. And then I just wanted to reflect finally on, and it was nice, Ken, that you mentioned Finland. I live in Finland. Finland has changed dramatically from the Ukraine war. And what's been amazing about that is Finland was completely committed to going net carbon zero by 2030. But then with the Ukraine war, we see that the Finnish government, Finnish citizens are just not, climate change is not on the agenda anymore. So that was what was interesting in the FT article, that Poland and Italy actually are now backing having a stronger sets of targets. But one thing I just want to throw out here from Finland is this idea of what we could construe as the role of citizens. And for the Finnish approach to comprehensive security, which ultimately would be required to govern any kind of these complex long-term problems, it has to be grassroots all the way down to the citizen level of engagement. And I wanted to ask you in your work, what role do you see for the citizen consumer in terms of bringing about this optimistic outcome? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Amade, for also raising some theoretical questions in addition to policy questions. And I think the question of political regimes, which political regimes and economic models are dominant, and are they a barrier or are they a catalyst to addressing some of these challenges? I think it's a very interesting question that we'll get to dig into in the Q&A. So we'll go next to Professor Bulkeley. And Professor Harriet Bulkeley holds joint appointments as professor in the Department of Geography at Durham University and the Copernicus Institute, Utrecht University. Her research is concerned with the process, practices, and politics of environmental governance. And she has particular expertise in the area of climate change, nature, energy, and urban sustainability. She's known for her pioneering work on cities and climate change and has published 8 books, several edited collections, and over 80 papers, including covering all those topics that I mentioned. Professor Bulkeley also last year was awarded an OBE in the King's Birthday Honours List in recognition of her services to geography and environmental governance. So Professor Bulkeley, what are some of the reflections that you have from the lecture, but also the conversations in your work?
Thank you very much, Ken, and it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to have had a chance to read your book. Harrow and I were discussing earlier, Tom, how being invited to such panels, apart from the enjoyable conversation, it's such a pleasure to actually say, I've got to sit down and read a book. So for anybody who thinks that they haven't got time to read a book, you definitely have got time. This is, you know, you've got a long time to read a book about long problems, right? But yeah, there's a lot of detail in the book that we didn't obviously have time to get into in the talk, Tom. And I just wanted to kind of maybe pull out a few of those things that I reflected, both hearing you speak and also from the book itself. I think the first thing to kind of reflect on maybe together is a little bit about whether it's that climate change is not considered to be a long problem or it's considered to be a long problem in the wrong way. So is it considered to be a long problem? I mean, in the way that, say, integrated assessment models and other devices that we have to interpret climate change over long periods of time, those devices understand it in particular ways, which effectively mean that we have to continually have a 3% GDP increase every year. So that's the way the models are designed. That's their kind of starting and finishing assumption. And that makes them think about climate change in a particular way over the long term. So I don't know whether it's that they are never thought of as long problems. So I think that, you know, is it that we actually have to change the way in which they're thought about as long problems in order to be able to resolve them? So that's one thing. The other thing that you do get into in the book is the fact that climate change is not a singularity, but is actually multiple different problems. And the most easiest way of thinking about that is mitigation and adaptation. But it's actually, as Ken was kind enough to say, my work really focuses on cities, and it's there where you can really get into a lot of granularity about what the climate problem is. It's on the one hand a matter of draft insulation, and on the other hand a matter of, you know, where are you going to build the next generation of cities like Cambridge, right? And that is both an extremely short problem. Where do I go and buy insulation tomorrow if I need to put some underneath my floorboards? And then how the city itself emerges. And so is it also worth thinking about that, like the multiplicity of temporality in climate change? And a question then, if we focus on the long term, might we miss the short? So that's another thing to think about. And I mean, this is a very sort of academic set of questions, because now I'm going to, you know, we talked about whether it's long or not. Now I want to talk about whether it's a problem or not, right? So, but this is, you know, some of the work that I've done myself over time is to think about this question of how we accomplish climate governance. And a lot of my thinking has been around this idea of how do we come to understand that we have a problem we call climate change, and the extent to which the longer we think of the problem of climate change, is the framing of it as a problem useful anymore? You do in the book distinguish between this idea of ongoing problems like the provision of education or healthcare from a long problem like climate change. And I think that's really useful. But I also wonder whether we are so wedded to the idea that climate change is something that we have to control and have to solve, that we will make it go away. That we actually don't think about it as an ongoing condition. And for me, the most parallel issue is to think about gender. I think we continue to have a condition of gender inequality in society, in all societies. What that condition is, how it's manifest, has changed in multiple different ways over time. But it still remains a condition of the population, to use some theory that I like. That always needs to be improved. And a lot of what I think about in this space is the extent to which our intention to solve and make climate change go away is itself the problem. Anyway, those are just a few things. I had others, but we'll talk about them all. But it was really thought-provoking, and I really enjoyed reading it. Thank you, Tom.
Great. Thank you, Professor Bulkeley, as well, for building on the theme of teasing out some of the way we think about, you know, making a problem salient, like knowing that we have a problem like climate change, but also thinking about, should we solve it, or is it a condition that we have to deal with as we think about other problems? And also the issue of cross-cutting problems and how we should think about them. So I think to round off these initial kind of set of remarks, last but not least, we have Ms Pamla Gopaul, who's joining us online from South Africa. We'd planned initially to have Pamla here in person, but unfortunately that wasn't the case, but glad to have you remotely. She is the Senior Program Officer for Strategic Initiatives at the African Union Development Agency, or NEPAD, where she has established the agency's policy bridge tank, which serves to advise African member states in implementing their policies. And she has also worked to support African member states in the G20 through the Think Tanks Forum and coordinating think tanks to develop some of the ideas and insights to advise African member states. More importantly, and I think relevant to the discussion here today, she's also been supporting African member states to implement their African Union Agenda 2063 by bringing to their attention some of the cutting edge research that should inform or would inform their policies. So without much ado, Pamla, I'll hand over the digital floor to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ken, and good afternoon to you all, to the esteemed panelists in front and to the honored guests. It's a true pleasure to join you at this important conversation. And while I'm unable to be with you in person due to visa delays, I'm grateful that I have this opportunity to join you virtually. And in many ways, this digital connection reflects the very spirit of our conversation today on how we must transcend borders, time zones, and even traditional formats to confront the long problems of our time. It is a reminder that while distance may separate us physically, I think shared purpose can still bring us together in a meaningful way. So I would like to also just use this opportunity very quickly to extend my sincere thanks to the Center for Study of Existential Risk, the Center of Climate Engagement, and the Hughes Hall for hosting this event and for creating a space where long-term thinking and global cooperation are not only encouraged, but urgently needed. This is a particular honor for me to share a platform and a panel with Professor Thomas Hale, as well as Lord Martin Rees, Professor Harriet Bulkeley, and Professor Hamadi, who your research really, continues to illuminate the intersections of both climate, cities, and justice. So thank you again for having me. In the spirit of Professor Hamadi's optimism and giving us the information that the EU now is, has reached its 1% of climate goals, as well as the citizen engagement, I'm going to take the very similar approach of a very optimistic one, but also a real one from the perspective and ecosystem that I work in. So when we talk about Africa's long-term global risks like climate change, inequality, and demographic shifts, Africa is at the center of it all. And we're not just facing these challenges, we are leading the way in finding some of these solutions. Our strength in how we think about the future across the continent, we have always valued integrated responsibilities, whether it's in the spirit of Ubuntu or indigenous land stewardship. These aren't just cultural values, they're practical ways of governing the long term. And they remind us that the future isn't, some far off idea. It's something we're shaping every day. And in that mindset, in that living inheritance is where Africa's real power lies. When you're aligned to Professor Hale's core argument in the book, we are reminded that long problems like climate change and inequality are hard to govern because they unfold over decades, while our political systems operate in short-term cycles. But Africa is really embracing it, in some cases experimenting with long horizon frameworks. And in countries like Rwanda, in Nigeria, in Kenya, Botswana, as well as Ghana, Ethiopia is one of the fastest growing economies in the continent, and South Africa, where I'm speaking to you from today, all have aims and aspirations to position itself in the global economies, focusing on inclusive growth, human capital development, and environmental sustainability. And these are not just plans, they are signals of intent to govern across the times. Professor Hale alluded to the African Union Agenda 2063, which is a 50-year vision rooted in inclusive, sustainable development. This is indeed Africa's big vision for the future, and the second 10-year implementation plan is meant to speed up things. It includes 7 bold goals called moonshots. These moonshots, we feel most of the time we think that it's unattainable, but they are possible if there's a need for long-term thinking and just not short-term fixes. And these goals, like ending hunger, making energy accessible, boosting industry, all becoming a global player, which we see Africa now, having a seat at the G20. African governments, we know, must go beyond the election cycles in terms of how they govern their economies. But countries also, it is important to raise more of their domestic resources so that they can fund these goals and aspirations. And as, again, Professor Hamidi spoke about, having inclusive, people-centric decision-making is of paramount. But these shared continental missions, are more and more not being isolated, but are aligning with the national programs of the continent. And this, the success of these hinges a lot on deepening regional integration, like we have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and as well as investing in the youth and human capital. So these moonshots are attainable while we align it with our national development plans. African needs to govern for the long term with the people-centric approach that we spoke about. In terms of bridging global and local governance, in some cases, Africa is not being governed, but it is indeed governing forward. And what do I mean by this? I mean that Africa's regional institutions are already showing what it means to lead with long-term visions and cross-border cooperation. It's not just responding to problems, they are building systems that look ahead and work across nations. And I'll give you two quick examples about this. One is the Green Wall, the Great Green Wall Initiative, where it's not just about planting trees, but it's about restoring degraded land. It's about creating jobs, improving food security, and reducing forced migration across 11 countries in the Sahel. It's long-term solution to climate and social challenges that don't just stop at its national borders. The second example is Africa CDC, where we saw the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, where during COVID, they were able to coordinate continent-wide on health responses. And this helped countries share their data and distribute vaccines. And also those experiences will certainly prepare us for future outbreaks. We come to a platform today where we find ourselves with researchers, with intellectuals such as yourself. And we know that we cannot just work alone. We must step forward and not just analyze the dynamics of long problems, but we need to co-design the solutions with policymakers. And as Ken said, the program that I lead, called the Africa Policy Bridge Tank, aims to do precisely this. I have been making key connections with systemic thinking, such as the life economy studies, where we have joined hands with 10 other international organizations like UN UNRWA, OECD, UNDP, the Asian Development Bank, etc. And this study helps to integrate environmental, social, and economic goals, addressing root causes rather than symptoms, which are essential for long-term problems. We will be looking at new matrices going beyond GDP, like Inclusive Wealth Index and Social Wellbeing Index, to measure what truly matters, and that is the people-centric approach that we spoke about. also looking at new institutions, and we've seen this and witnessed this during the Brussels G20 social summit, where they are thinking on having embedded equity and sustainability into the economic systems. But this means that we require new narratives that reframe the long-term governance in a shared opportunity. So this also means that academia must meet government and not just be critics alone, but in creation with institutions such as the one I represent, which is the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD. And Professor Hale's, call for governance models can also manage long-term complexes through these models that I'm talking about in terms of a transformative paradigm that embeds economic activity with social and economic systems. Just yesterday, we concluded the G20 Development Working Group meeting, where we currently finalizing the G20 call to action, which emphasizes universal social protection floors. And this is concrete policy tools that help societies manage long-term risks like poverty, unemployment, and climate shocks. So addressing the lag in policy circles, we must confront the political realities. We know that long-term problems are hard to solve in short-term systems that we have, but we shouldn't also look at it as an excuse. I think it is important that it is a design challenge that we have, and we need to embrace that through by embedding long-term goals into short-term mandates through options like constitutional commitments, fiscal rules, etc., and social compacts. In Africa alone, to use social protection floors as institutional anchors persist across political circles. And for example, in 2024 and upcoming now in 2025, at least 30 African countries will undergo elections. But what is important is to ensure continuity even when leadership changes. And we often say, we have to leverage digital tools and have participatory platforms to build public support for long-term policies. I think is absolutely essential as well. And, just to add also to the call for inclusive institutions, as Professor Hale's book alludes to, resonates deeply with Africa's demand for a seat at the table. In terms of the African group of negotiations, has pursued climate justice and loss and damage financing. The inclusion of the African Union, as I mentioned, in the G20 is a step forward, and we must move, from being present to having power in terms of consulting in the co-design of how we work, as well as Africa's experiences show that solidarity as well as foresight in systems thinking are not luxuries, but it's survival and innovative strategies that are at play. And I'd just like to end and speak about the fact that we find ourselves confronted with long-term problems in current times. And I see the long problems and short solutions where research informs policy, but where also policy serves its people and where people can shape that future. And not just for the next election, but I think mainly for the next generation that we will see ahead of us, or some of us might not see. And to solve the long-term challenges, we must redefine the progress. And this alludes to the life economies that I was talking about, that creates powerful alternatives in placing people, planet, and purpose at the center of economic life. And recently, this also aligns in the vision of the Undersecretary General's recent appointment of 14 global experts to a high-level expert group going beyond GDP. And their task is to develop these new ways of measuring progress that reflect what truly matters, and that is people and the planet. So therefore, I think it is absolutely essential that we don't only adopt these models, but we must lead in shaping them, ensuring they reflect our values, our realities, as well as the aspirations that we speak about. Thank you very much again, Ken, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Pamela, for that very stimulating kind of a presentation where you've drawn examples of how we need new narratives, shown how we need a people-centered approach. And for this century, for example, almost half of the future generations will come from Africa, but also building the kinds of institutions that will help us to address these challenges. So I think at this juncture then, as we're rounding off, we'll turn to the audience and take a couple of questions. So we have a Slido that we put up online, so please type in your questions there. And to kick us off, as my colleague Laura is setting that up, we have already received quite a number of questions, so I'll just put them out there to the panel, and you can pick the question that you like most and respond to. So the first question is, I'll read out three. What is your advice? What is your advice for organizations that are already working to implement some of the findings discussed with national governments, for example, through future generations legislation, as is ongoing in Australia and New Zealand currently? Question number two, as societal and environmental challenges become ever more complex, arguably requiring understanding of complex science and technological issues, how can we guard against authoritarianism becoming the natural pathway to their governance? And the third question is, are there any cultural differences in how governments and or companies approach long problems? So I think we'll go in reverse of the panel, and starting with Tom, going the other way around, and then feel free to pick a question that you like most, or the one that you dislike the most.
Great. Well, let me pick on if I may, since I get first pick very generously, I'll take the second one, because also I think it connects to some of the themes that some of my distinguished colleagues here mentioned. So there's a worry that many people have. I think the question exemplifies this worry that more complex issues, more long-term issues, more scientific issues necessitate more technocratic solutions, and therefore pushes away from more democratic solutions. And is there kind of a benign, more authoritarian technocratic solution to a long problem? And I'm actually, in the book, it talks about this, very adamant that democracy is enhanced by a long-term view, not undermined by it. And there is a role for technocracy, absolutely. And some of the trustee type institutions I talk about, which have a longer-term time frame, are good examples of that. The California Resources Board is an example. The role of central banks or courts in democratic constitutional society, political systems are further examples of that. But note that the other element to that we need to have at the center of these kinds of solutions are more participatory, more bottom-up, more deliberative sort of models of democracy. And so my own view is that, as your question alludes to, we are facing a moment of crisis for democracy. Of course, our legacy institutions, mostly sort of 19th century designs, are showing themselves to be unsatisfactory for many people of different political persuasions. And to my mind, part of the solutions is not a full one, but for the temporal dimension, having both more technocratic institutions that are empowered alongside more deliberative and participatory ones is a way to complement representative democracy as we know it. So imagine, for example, we had a way to propose laws that came from citizen juries, randomly selected sets of people who would deliberate on an issue and give recommendations to legislators on what they could do. And imagine those legislators also had recommendations from scientific technocratic bodies on what the best, most efficient, effective response would be. And those two things were injects into our current sort of system where we rely on people who are elected every few years to make decisions. If that were done more systematically, and we see bits and pieces of that across many different kinds of systems, I think we'd actually have a nice upgrade to our conventional democratic decision-making processes. Final word, some people think that long-term governance is better done by authoritarians than by Democrats. And if you look at the countries in the world who are doing the most climate change investment, adaptation and mitigation, early childhood education, other sort of benchmarks, you would say, for effective long-term problem solving, they tend to be, if you will, the usual suspects, the Finlands, the Denmarks, the Swedens. So there's clearly no kind of autocracy that's higher at the top of that list. People point to China and Singapore as two examples of countries that use long-term planning. They certainly do, and there's advantages, I would say, to using long-term planning, whether you're an authoritarian or a Democrat. There's no democratic disadvantage on long problems, and I would argue, on average, democracies tend to perform a bit better than autocracies overall. I'll let any of these pick up any other questions. Yep.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So one of your questions was about what advice would you give to those organizations who are already working in this space? So I think I've got two pieces of advice. I love giving advice, so this is a terrible question to ask me. The first thing I would say is think about where you can see long solutionism. So if we've got long problems, where can we actually see long solutionism? And Tom gives some good examples in his book. My personal favorite, and it relates to something that you raised in your comments about Ely Cathedral, is actually the Church of Sweden. Outside of Lund, a town in the southern part of Sweden, which has a rather large university, they're building a new city of about 35,000 people. Now, that may be familiar to some people living in Cambridge. They're building on land that the Church of Sweden own. And the Church of Sweden have required the building of the city to take 1,000-year perspective. And so they are building it with this idea of 1,000 years into the future, because the Church of Sweden apparently feels that it's going to be around in 1,000 years. So it's a little bit like you were saying earlier, that they feel that they know what other people will like in 1,000 years' time, which will be the Church of Sweden, partly. But this idea of an organization that can literally think 1,000 years into the future is really intriguing. But one of the most intriguing things about how they're then building that development is that they're leaving spaces empty to work out what they want to do later. So they're trying to leave space for what I would call indeterminacy. So not uncertainty, not we don't know what to do here, but we don't know what will be the good thing to do here. So they're creating spaces for that. So I would think about, where can you see for your organization the kind of long solutionism that you would like to emulate? And the second thing is related to that sense of leaving space, is also leaving space to fail. And the experimentation and the catalytic kind of potential that Tom mentioned in his talk, but also thinks about in the book in further depth, is about also allowing conditions where not everything that we try out will be right. Now, I like experimentation a lot. It's one of the things that I work on a great deal. I have some differences of view with Tom's approach to experimentation, which I'm sure we'll discuss further. But for me, experimentation is precisely there, not necessarily to learn in the way that we often think about it, but actually to try out what we think is good. So I think of it much more as an ethical pursuit rather than a learning pursuit. And I think that that's something that organizations who are trying to work into this space of long problems, we need to decide what it means to be a good city under conditions of climate change, or a good organization, things like this. And we can't find out just by thinking about it. We actually have to try things out, try them on for size. So that's what I would say. I like your other questions too, but I'm going to pass it on.
So Ken, we're going to ask you to repeat the third question, because I didn't.
Cultural differences.
Okay, maybe I could, because I
Yeah.
came up with an imaginary question. I haven't.
Please, that's okay. That's very, that's experimental. Yeah.
Fortunately, it fits with cultural differences.
Yes.
And I think there is a theme that's starting to echo about this, the citizen engagement. And I think that this ties deep. I'm going to go back to the theory and Bob Cohen's work, and how do we tackle this problem of collective action, which ultimately if we think of the atmospheric commons, what is each of our role in terms of addressing that? I mean, we're all citizen consumers and trying to equalize. Yes, we're experts up here for this moment, but we're all citizen consumers, and looking at how, in a way, there's a breakdown of instrumental rationality that none of us individually can make a difference, but collectively we do. How do we empower individual agents so that we can each feel that with our micro contributions of driving a car, making food choices, that we can actually make a difference? So I think that culturally, probably answering that question is going to be quite different if we're in Africa. If we're in Finland, it's going to look very different from if we're in the UK. So I think there is a cultural dimension to that. And then I wanted to reflect on the way I had a meeting with one of the teaching associates who's actually in the Anthropocene studies yesterday, who came and met with me about that Phil program. And he was mentioning how when it came to the Paris Accords and setting that 1.5 degree target, that the island peoples who have that immediate existential risk of being flooded, that they ended up, I think you even mentioned, you have some aspect of that in your book, that they were pivotal in terms of bringing that constellation of existential risk issues to the table. So in a way, maybe if we understand as the existential risk that indigenous peoples that are facing, that island peoples are facing, that every group probably has its own different fractional piece of this existential risk. And to make that salient, it's very cultural, how different peoples will experience that within their geopolitical circumstances. And that can add up to very specific leverage points to make those policy differences. So thank you so much for the question. I'm going to turn it over now to Lord Martin Rees.
Well, thank you very much. Just following up on climate, I think the CO2 problem is unique in that it's got to be done by everyone, or otherwise it makes no difference. And the contribution that we make by going towards net zero, it's 1 or 2% of the world's contribution. That's true. So it's very hard to motivate any country, especially a poor country, to make sacrifices when they're making a tiny difference. It's far harder, obviously, to motivate them to spend money on local mitigation than on cutting down CO2. So that's why it's especially horrid problem to deal with. I wanted to just emphasize a bit more how things are complicated, not just by geopolitical uncertainties, but by the rate of change. I mean, obviously, we've seen huge rates of change, which has changed the nature of governance and social media, etc., within the last 10 or 20 years. We are having major changes in medicine, big new threats from bioweapons and engineered pandemics. Also, ethical issues about whether we can actually genetically actually change people significantly, and should that be allowed or not, all these things. And these are far more challenging and far more difficult to deal with than climate change. And so to keep the focus on climate change in the face of all these complexities is, in my opinion, very hard. It's the one thing where we can predict the consequence of what we're doing. But there could be nuclear wars in the meantime. It could be that the nature of human beings may start to change in a systematic way due to genetic modification or something like that. We just got no idea. So that's why I saying, as I did at the beginning, that the difference between the present time and earlier centuries is twofold. First, things are changing much faster within a single lifetime. And secondly, the impact of anything we do cascades globally. And that makes the world far more dangerous. So that's why I'm a bit of a doom-monger in this whole area, I'm afraid.
Great.
Can I pick up on the point of rates of change? Because it's, I think I have this one, but thank you. So one of the things I didn't talk about in the talk, but is in the book and the social science part, which I promised, now you've provoked me into going into. But if we have long problems, the more we have looking at problem spans over time, then rates of change matter more than levels, right? So in the social science world, we often think about the level of some outcome of interest as the thing to study and matter. But actually, what we really should care about for time expands is the rate of change in that level. So if we are doing our conventional international relations analysis of security, is country A more powerful than country B? Let's look at their tanks and bombs and what things. What actually matters over a 100-year struggle between those countries, of course, would be the ability of those countries' economies to produce tanks and bombs and things, and maybe actually something more fundamental about the innovation in those economies that are moving on to other kinds of weaponry. So if we have more long problems, we need to think much more about rates of change as social scientists. And I think your point on the acceleration of change is a really important one, because as that temporal horizon of what you can predict gets closer, more things become long problems effectively because the uncertainty around them grows. So I think it's a really insightful role.
Great. So I think we've come now to the end of the session, and I find myself in that unenviable position where the discussion is really getting great, but we've come kind of to the end. So I think in terms of closing now, I'll ask kind of us to give a round of applause to our audience, to our panel, and those here and those online. And just to say that the conversation hasn't ended, and just to make sure that we finalize this very well, Pamla, because you haven't gotten to weigh in, can you give us one optimistic message in 30 seconds to round us off and close this session before?
I think we need to work with pace and speed. It's absolutely essential. Africa is very disproportionately affected by climate change, as everybody knows, and contributes to the global emissions. But I think that there's optimism in the terms of investing in renewable energy, in scaling up the adaptation, in involving it in peace building efforts, as well as regional bodies like the African Union who are mediating conflicts and promoting democratic norms. So thank you very much for the opportunity. And I'm really sorry again, I wasn't able to join in person.
Great, thank you for that very helpful message, Pamela. And I think just to conclude the last bit of information, huge thank you to a team to make this happen. Huge thank you to Professor Harold Van Asselt and Dr. Ellie Harrington, who really helped to conceptualize this whole idea of the series, seminar series. There's 2 more to come, so stay tuned. The topics will be a surprise, but very interesting. But also other colleagues who've been working behind the scenes to make sure it all comes together. There's Laura, there's Claire, and Nicole. A huge thank you to them, and a huge thank you to everyone for making a time to this session.